Good day. Today is Wednesday, 27th November 2024, and the last 24 hours have confirmed conclusively that we remain trapped on the escalatory escalator. I say this because despite the demonstrated power that the Russians have in achieving escalatory dominance, especially in terms of the Ukraine conflict, but arguably in Europe now, the United States and the NATO alliance have persisted in their ongoing attempts to provoke the Russians. I say that because over the last few hours, late yesterday to be precise, we got the following statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense. And I'm going to read it. It is on the Russian Ministry of Defense's Telegram channel. According to the confirmed data, in the last 3 days, the Ukrainian armed forces carried out 2 strikes at objects in Kursk region by long-range Western-made weaponry. On 23rd November, the enemy fired 5 US-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles at a position of a S-400 anti-aircraft battalion near Lotarevka, 37 kilometers northwest of Kursk. During a surface-to-air battle, a Panzer anti-aircraft machine gun crew protecting the battalion destroyed 3 ATACMS missiles and 2 hit their intended targets. What this says, the translation is not perfect, is that a Panzer point defense system managed to destroy 3 ATACMS missiles, but 2 other ones managed to get through and hit their targets. And then the report from the Defense Ministry goes on to say, as a result of the strike, a radar was damaged. There are casualties amongst the personnel. Now, there's been some reports that the casualties are people injured rather than killed, but this has come from the Russian media and is not confirmed by the Defense Ministry itself. Anyway, the report then continues. On 25th November, the Kiev regime delivered one more strike by 8 ATACMS operational tactical missiles at the Kursk Vostochny airfield near Khalino. 7 missiles were shot down by S-400 surface-to-air missiles and Panzer anti-aircraft machine gun systems. 1 missile hit the assigned target. 2 servicemen were lightly wounded, and infrastructure objects sustained minor damage by the missile strike. After investigating the attack sites, it was confirmed that the Ukrainian military delivered strikes by US-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles. The Russian Defense Ministry controls the current situation. Retaliatory measures are being prepared. And the Ministry of Defense has now provided photos of the debris of the ATACMS missiles that carried out the strike. There's a photo of the missile that attacked the airfield. There's no photos so far that I'm aware of the missiles that attacked the battery. Oh, actually, there are. Sorry, I correct that. There are also photos of the missile that the 2 missiles that struck the battery, at least the debris from these missiles. Now, what the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us is that there were 2 strikes on 2 different days. The first one on a surface-to-air missile battery, an S-400 battery, with 5 ATACMS. 3 were shot down, 2 got through. The 2 did damage to a radar system and killed, perhaps, or injured some of the crew. It doesn't seem, however, that the entire battery was destroyed or rendered inoperable. Then there was a follow-up strike on the airfield, on an airfield, a military airfield, but this time only 1 out of 8 ATACMS missiles got through and only did minor damage. Here I understand that the reports are saying that it was in fact the Russian media are reporting that 2 Russian military personnel were lightly wounded. So again, if I may make an observation, this is once again a relatively unsuccessful succession of strikes. We've had a succession of strikes involving 13 ATACMS missiles in relatively short supply and of high cost, for which there is no replacement, and which I personally believe are no longer in production. In fact, I don't believe that they've been in production for roughly 20 years. And for the record, the missiles that we used in these attacks, these 2 attacks, judging from the debris and what some people with much sharper eyes than me have been able to ascertain by reading the stenciled reports, the things on the missiles, on the debris, the words on the missile debris, it appears that they might have been built in the 1990s. Presumably they've been updated since then, but these were relatively old missiles, no doubt refurbished missiles, perhaps modernized to some degree, and by the way, they used cluster warheads, which is, however, what you would expect in a strike against area targets, which is what a surface-to-air missile battery and a airfield, of course, are. So anyway, to come back, 13 missiles launched altogether in 2 separate strikes, of which only 3 got through. And in one case, against the main target, which was clearly the airfield, only relatively minor damage appears to have been done. In the earlier case, against the air defense missile battery that was presumably protecting the airfield, because I suspect that the 2 attacks were interconnected with each other, against the air defense missile battery that was protecting the airfield, well, damage appears to have been done to a radar system, but it seems as if the air defense battery overall continued to be and remained operational. A heavy expenditure of expensive missiles, of which only a limited quantity exists, and which are probably, in my opinion, no longer in production, to achieve, frankly, disappointing results. There's no reason to think that the airfield cannot operate. There's no reports of any damage to aircraft, and the radar, the air defense radar that was damaged, well, it might have been severely damaged for all we know and might have been made inoperable, but the air defense battery overall is still functioning. Not, I would have thought, a good trade. Now, there has been some discussion as to the exact number of missiles that Ukraine has. There were reports that Ukraine, previous to these attacks, had something like 50 operational ATACMS missiles. And there are also reports in the media, the Western media, that Britain and France have now supplied Ukraine with a total of around 150 Storm Shadow missiles, Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles. So perhaps we're looking at 200 missiles, ATACMS, Storm Shadows and Scalps in total. And there have been now four attacks, 3 with ATACMS missiles, 1 with Storm Shadow missiles, and we see that despite the heavy expenditure of missiles, the results have been very disappointing. Contrast that with what the Russians have been doing. Perhaps, as I said, let's be generous and assume 200 missiles supplied to Ukraine before this missile offensive began. The Russians have been known on occasion to launch as many as 180 missiles in a single strike. And the last strike, one which took place, as I remember, just about a week ago, that involved 120 missiles launched on a single strike over the course of a single day, or rather single night and early part of one day. So these strikes really are not effective in any significant or viable way. They are not going to change the military balance in Kursk region, where the focus for these strikes is. They're not improving Ukraine's overall military situation in any significant way. They are obviously weapon systems that are orders of magnitude less powerful than the Oreshnik system that the Russians used against the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro. The Russians have, however, made it clear that they regard attacks on their internationally recognized territory, on Russia itself, pre-2014 Russia, as they treat that as these attacks as red lines. They say that Western personnel and technicians must be engaged in conducting these attacks, and no one is denying that or contradicting the Russians when they say that. So incredibly aggressive, extraordinarily provocative steps continue to be done in order to do what precisely? To provoke the Russians, because that is the only explanation for the step which has just been, these steps which have just been taken. Provoke the Russians into doing what exactly? What is it exactly that the West thinks that the Russians might do, which would turn out to be to the West's advantage? Well, again, it's not difficult ultimately to work out the thinking that the West had when the decision was made, or at least the Biden administration had, when they made the decision some weeks ago, in circumstances, by the way, that have not been explained, to conduct missile strikes deep inside Russia. The rationale was to put the Russians in a bind. Either the Russians react to the missile strikes, or they're exposed as a paper tiger. But the expectation was that the Russians would not react to the missile strikes because, or at least not in a public and visible way, because the assumption clearly was that the only way in which the Russians could conduct missile strikes in a major, significant way was either through the use of nuclear weapons or through the use of smaller missiles, like perhaps the Zircon or the Kinjal, which could only do limited damage to Western facilities, but which would put the West in a position where they would be able to say that the Russians were acting aggressively. And the result was what we have seen has ultimately thrown the whole calculus on its head. The Russians have acted in ways that no one expected. They have demonstrated that they actually do have massive escalatory dominance in this area, because with the Oreshnik, they possess a system against which the West has no defense, and for which there is no Western analog. Nonetheless, despite all of that, despite the fact that the rationale, the calculus, the attempt to bluff the Russians into some kind of humiliation, to expose them as a paper tiger, or to goad them into conducting relatively minor strikes against Western targets, which would nonetheless put Donald Trump on the back foot, forcing him to cut off any prospect of further negotiations with the Russians. Despite the fact that all that calculation has been thrown out of the window, the Russians, having now demonstrated that they have the ability to conduct strikes anywhere in Europe against any NATO target with overwhelming force, whilst still doing so using only conventional weapons. Well, despite that, we see that this train, this escalatory train, has left the station, and there is no ability, or at least no will, to turn back, to put a brake, to tell the Ukrainians, look, a miscalculation took place, this whole thing is becoming much too dangerous, we have to stop. Decisions made in anger, as I've said many times, are repented at leisure. The leadership of the West are very frightened and very angry as they sense that the war in Ukraine is being lost by Ukraine, and as they worry about Donald Trump's latest moves. They made the decision a few weeks ago, probably around the time of Trump's election, to conduct these strikes on Russia, and now they can't bring themselves to stop, despite the fact that the Russians have demonstrated that they have a capability, an immensely powerful capability, that no one in the West seems to have realized that they had. Well, that then brings us to what the Russians are now going to do. The Russian Defense Ministry, in that report which I've just read out, says that the Russians have the situation under control in Kursk region, and we see that they have done. Out of 13 missiles launched, only 3 got through and hit their targets. So the Russians do have the situation under control. And by the way, and for the record, I believe what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying in this report. I have no reason to think that they are misrepresenting the facts, and I notice that no one across the Western media is saying anything about this latest Russian Defense Ministry report. Nobody's contradicting its truth, just to say. So, the Russians have said that they will respond to this latest attack, despite the fact that they have the situation under control. And there were reports circulating yesterday that the Kapustin Yar Cosmodrome and Space Center, north of the Caspian Sea, near Astrakhan, the place from which it is widely believed that these missiles, the Oreshniks, are being launched, that it has been closed to air traffic. The area around it has been closed to air traffic from the 30th of November. So it looks like around the 30th of November, another massive missile strike, presumably involving an Oreshnik missile, will take place. And of course, we're left guessing about the targets. Now, I want to say a few things about the way in which this whole story is being covered in the media. I have been scanning the British media today, the various newspapers, the media here in London. I have found barely any mention of this Russian Defense Ministry statement. You will find a few squirreled away in live updates and things like that, but certainly no big headline discussing the fact that the Russians have made this statement about these 2 further ATACMS strikes that they have done. This contrasts with the way last week that the first reports of the ATACMS strikes, the first reported ATACMS strike and the first Storm Shadow strike received very, very heavy publicity in the Western media indeed. When the Russians responded with the Oreshnik strike against the Yuzhmash factory, well, again, it would be untrue to say that there was complete silence in the Western media about what had happened. But again, the story was not given anything like the weight that, in my opinion, it should have done. It was certainly not the headline story that I could see. And reporting about it ceased after a few hours. And of this latest statement, as I said, from the Russian Defense Ministry, and the threat of more strikes by the Russians, scarcely anything has been said at all. Moreover, as far as I am aware, no official of any Western government, apart from Chancellor Scholz in Germany and a few other European leaders, have commented about the Oreshnik strike. I'm not aware that Prime Minister Starmer has said very much about it. There's been a few mumbled words from the British government. The French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Barrot, his only comment made to the BBC, to Laura Kunsberg, was to say that France would basically continue to support Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory. There has been no attempt to inform the Western public more widely about the growing danger of this escalatory cycle that we are trapped in. There is much discussion about other things. There's been discussion about the ceasefire that has been achieved, perhaps between Israel and Hezbollah in the Middle East. I will come to that. But overall, there is clearly a concerted move, which I can only assume must have been agreed, to downplay this story. And I have to say, I find that irresponsible in the extreme. If the intention is not to alarm the Western public, I think that amounts to misleading the Western public, because the situation is extremely alarming indeed, and the Western public, which, let's remember, in the so-called democracies of the West, is supposed to be the agency that has ultimate power, needs to be kept informed about what is happening and about the dangers and threats to itself. So, keeping this information away from the Western public seems to me incredibly reckless, completely irresponsible, and compounds the recklessness and irresponsibility that we have already seen. Now, that, of course, also increases the risk that something is going to happen that will cause the escalation, the pattern of escalation, to spiral completely out of control. Now, the Russians have made various statements since the Oreshnik strike. They've said that they do continue to reserve the right to attack Western NATO military facilities in Europe. They haven't retreated from that in any way. And for all I know, that is what they're now going to do. Nobody knows yet what exactly it is that the Russians do intend to do. But we'll see. Alternatively, they might again decide to limit their retaliation to a strike on Ukrainian territory. Now that, I think, is probably what the Russians are going to do. I think the Russians understand very well that part of the purpose of this provocative behavior is to goad them into doing something that will prevent Donald Trump, once he becomes president, from moving forward with whatever peace initiative he has in mind. So I think it is more likely than not that the Russians will initially confine their attack to Ukrainian territory itself. But then that brings us to the question of what exactly within Ukraine the Russians might attack. Now, they've recently conducted a major strike on the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro. No pictures have been published of that factory. There were satellite photos that appeared some days ago which purported to show the Yuzhmash factory after the strike with no apparent damage. I have since been told that that photograph should be treated with great caution. I don't know, one way or the other. I've heard on what I consider extremely sound authority that the Yuzhmash plant has been, in effect, completely destroyed. But I've seen no actual physical evidence of that. But that was a strike focused on a Ukrainian military-industrial facility. There are other positions, other locations in Ukraine where Westerners are much more likely to be, or at least to be in number. And it could also be the case that the Russians next time will escalate their targets within Ukraine, not just to take in Western personnel, but to take in more important strategic targets. They might, for example, attack the Patriot missile batteries near Kiev. They might attack the political leadership of Ukraine, the government quarter in Ukraine, for the first time making a sustained attempt to go after the leaders of Ukraine. And of course, if a decapitation strike against the leaders of Ukraine is indeed conducted, and if it is successful, then that will create for the Western powers a whole further set of problems, because they will then be supporting a country which is in effect leaderless. Just saying. But anyway, I'm not going to speculate further about what the Russians are going to do. But given that there have been two more attacks after the Oreshnik strike, the worry has to be that when the Russians respond to these attacks with whatever it is that they're going to do next, this escalatory train that the Western leaders have set in motion will continue to rumble forward, and that we will continue to get more missile strikes against the Russians until eventually the Russians are goaded into doing that which clearly President Putin himself would prefer not to do, which is to conduct strikes on Western military targets outside Ukraine. Now, yesterday, in a live stream, we were privileged on the Duran to be interviewing Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, formerly of the United States Armed Forces. He informed us that he has been told by people who are well informed about these things. And obviously he's not disclosing his sources to us, but I am sure that he is a lot better informed about these matters than we are. Anyway, he told us that within the US intelligence community, they have information that there is now dissension in the Kremlin, that members of Russia's Security Council, people like Medvedev, but no doubt others, are becoming increasingly frustrated by Putin's caution in response to these ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes. And they're saying that the situation has now reached the point where, whatever the political calculus, the risk for Russia becomes greater if they do not respond forcefully against Western targets than it does if they continue to absorb these ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes, however ineffective militarily they might appear to be. And to repeat a point which I've made many times, that my friend and colleague Alex Christoforou has made many times, that Daniel Davis has made many times, that every single person who is generally involved about Russian affairs knows, and which many have made, Vladimir Putin is not the dictator of Russia, whatever many people may say. He may be the ultimate decision maker, but he has to take Russian public opinion into account, and he has to take opinion in the Kremlin into account as well. He can resist the pressure to respond forcefully for a time, but only for so long. Eventually, even he will probably decide that the risks of standing by, letting the Americans and the British go on doing what they're doing, have become too high, and that Russia must respond. And then if the Russians do respond, and if they do conduct strikes against Western military facilities in Europe, perhaps in the Middle East, who knows where precisely. There was a very alarming report on Russian television, which, taking Astrakhan as the possible launch center of the Oreshkin missile, discussed the kind of targets it could reach, and it gave figures for the number of minutes it would take the Oreshkin to reach these targets. And these targets included places in Europe, obviously, places in the Middle East. And if the Oreshkin were forward deployed to the Russian Far East, which is something the Russians are now talking about, it could also reach places in the continental United States, including places where certain strategic systems are located. Very dangerous situation indeed. But if the Russians do respond against a NATO target outside Ukraine, I come back to this question: what does the West in that case do? Do they retaliate using nuclear weapons, risking an all-out nuclear exchange? Admiral Buchanan of the United States recently spoke about how the United States might be capable of prevailing in the event of a nuclear war, provided that nuclear war was maintained at a contained level, though he did go on to say that this was absolutely not something that the United States wanted, and something that many people who have commented about his words also overlooked. he also said that the United States, in order to avoid these possibilities, needed to reopen dialogues with Russia and North Korea whilst maintaining its existing ongoing dialogue with China. Anyway, Admiral Buchanan did talk about the possibility of the United States prevailing in some kind of limited nuclear war, limited nuclear exchange against the Russians. I have to say, I think that is an incredibly reckless and dangerous idea. The Russians have repeatedly, throughout the Ukraine conflict, shown how their capabilities are being systematically underestimated. I think any idea that the United States would prevail against such an adversary in the event of a nuclear exchange is fatuous and incredibly dangerous. But anyway, I still can't quite bring myself to believe that there is anyone in the Pentagon who seriously wants to find themselves in that position. So let us say that there is a Russian Oreshnik strike on a base somewhere in Europe. That would be a shock to NATO, obviously. But what does the West in that do? How does Western public opinion respond to that situation? I don't know. I don't think that anybody has done a proper analytical study thinking this thing through. On that point, I should say that Seymour Hersh, celebrated US journalist that he is, has recently written a further piece discussing the recent escalation. I've not always gone along with everything that Seymour Hersh has said in recent years. About a year ago, he was talking about secret negotiations supposedly underway between the chief of the Russian General Staff, General Gerasimov, and the chief of the Ukrainian military, General Zaluzhny, to try and achieve a ceasefire. I said at the time that I thought that Seymour Hersh's sources were misleading him about that, and about this I am sure I was right. Anyway, this time, given that the information Seymour Hersh is providing is about internal US matters, I'm more inclined to believe him. In fact, I do believe him. He speaks of an angry, embittered President Biden, and about that I have absolutely no doubt that he is right. I think, by the way, that the theory that President Biden has been completely cut out of the discussions and of the decisions, and that all of these decisions are being somehow made in his name without him being really kept in the loop, almost certainly are wrong. I have experience of people with age-related mental health conditions, and my experience, very, very direct experience over a prolonged period of time, is that people like that, before their mind gives way, tend to become more obsessive and more bad-tempered and more insistent on having their way on that one thing that their mind focuses on. And in President Biden's case, I think that is not only the case, but I think he still has more cognitive understanding and more capacity for decision than many people acknowledge. Anyway, I agree, suffice to say, I agree with Seymour Hersh that Biden is an angry, embittered, resentful man. In my opinion, he has been that throughout his presidency, and I think he has become even more so since he was pushed aside by his own party back in July, and still more so since Kamala Harris lost the election on the 5th of November. So, anyway, Hersh talks about an angry, embittered president who's letting his anger and his sense of bitterness, his visceral feelings about Trump and Putin affect his decisions. And about that, I completely agree. He also talks about how many departments of the US government, and here he's clearly referring to the Pentagon and various sections of the intelligence community, were kept out of the loop in this decision. They were not consulted. Expert analysis from them was not sought. They are apparently unhappy and worried about this. But again, that is completely consistent with what we've seen from the Biden administration before. I happen to know that when the disastrous decision was made in February 2022 to freeze Russia's sovereign assets held in Euroclear and Clearview in the West, the central banks, the Federal Reserve Board, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, were not told in advance. They were presented with a fait accompli, and I believe that in the case of the Fed, they have confirmed as much. So decisions, this administration has a pattern of making decisions without previously seeking advice, expert advice, on what the consequences would be and of what the dangers of those decisions might be. So all of that rather reinforces my sense that we have been launched into a dangerous escalatory adventure, almost certainly based on, to a great extent, on feelings of anger and fear about the failure of Project Ukraine, about the election of Donald Trump, about worries about what Donald Trump himself might do, without any of this being properly thought through, without the dangers being properly acknowledged in advance. And I doubt that the people who are in Washington, in the White House, who appear to be making these decisions, are prepared to open up that discussion or to seek that advice even now, because they worry that if they did, these very same departments that were cut out, according to Seymour Hersh, from the consultation process, would come back and would say that the original decision was wrong and that it was a mistake not to consult them in advance. So that bureaucratically almost definitely means that this process is set to continue in the way that it is. Well, there we are. So I don't think that this has been thought through. I think we're riding on anger now. We're not operating on any proper calculus, but there is at the same time a decision being made that the public itself is to be kept as much in the dark about the dangers as possible. Well, even as this continues, we are still uncertain about the next moves of Donald Trump. And that brings me back to further comments that were made by Daniel Davis in our live stream yesterday, and which chime with certain further comments made by Seymour Hersh in his article on Substack, by the way, which you can find. And Daniel Davis said that Donald Trump does indeed want some kind of de-escalation of the crisis, and that will be his major priority once he takes office in January, and that he's signalling this fact to his various advisors, though it is not at all clear how he proposes to go ahead and do that. While Seymour Hersh goes further and says that Donald Trump and his team have actually established some contacts with the Russians already, that some discussions between the Russians and the Americans are already taking place, though not Trump and Putin speaking directly to each other, at least not for the moment, and that the Americans, that's to say the Trump team, are trying to work out how to proceed and are feeling their way forward. Now, I would like to believe that this is the case, but of course we only have Seymour Hersh's account of it to work from. There is no independent corroboration of this at all. There's been much debate and much discussion about why Donald Trump himself is saying absolutely nothing, and why he's not taken the step of calling Putin himself, and why his team are being as reticent as they are. Of course, if they are talking to the Russians, then that would probably be a further reason not to say too much in public. Negotiations or discussions of the kind that might be going on are best conducted with a certain level of discretion. If they become public knowledge, then the very fact that those discussions are taking place at all would open the way to those discussions becoming themselves a subject of controversy in a way that might derail the discussions. So, as I've discussed in several programs, there are compelling reasons for discretion. But I'm going to say that in order to understand Trump's reasons for saying as little as possible, it might be helpful to go back to what happened during the previous transition that he had to live through as president-elect in 2016 and early 2017. Now, at that time, Donald Trump was elected on trying to improve relations with Russia. And that, as he made clear many times, was his sincere wish. And his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, did establish some contacts with the Russians and did in fact conduct a telephone conversation whilst Flynn was on holiday in the Bahamas, if I remember correctly, with the Russian ambassador. The problem was that the United States intelligence community were listening in on the call. And as soon as the call took place, as I very well remember, an account of the call was circulated in the media, suggesting that Flynn had promised the Russians that in return for the Russians holding back from escalation, and the escalation in question arose from a previous decision of President Obama's to expel a large number of Russian diplomats from Washington. Many people in Washington were wondering why Putin held back from escalation, from retaliation, a mirror retaliation at that time. And there was all sorts of speculations and claims that this was because some kind of deal was being done behind the scenes between Putin and Trump. Anyway, it was suggested that over the course of this call, Flynn asked the Russian ambassador to hold back from retaliating to President Obama's move, and in return the United States, once Trump was inaugurated, would proceed to provide Russia with sanctions relief. The sanctions against Russia would be cancelled. And claims to this effect appeared in the media. Flynn himself was questioned about them by the FBI. Flynn initially denied it. He said that he hadn't suggested any such thing to the Russians. He'd never suggested that the Trump administration would provide sanctions relief in return for the Russians making any specific move. Then after the media storm, during the media storm, he appeared to go back on that. He said that, well, he didn't remember exactly, but he might have said something like that. He might have floated the possibility of future sanctions relief. The result was that he was forced to resign as Donald Trump's national security advisor. He was then prosecuted for lying to the FBI when he had denied that he had discussed providing the Russians with sanctions relief. He was convicted, and then some years later, the transcript of the conversation between Flynn and the Russian ambassador that had been made by the US intelligence community, and which was at the foundation of this whole story, and which had not been shown to Flynn, was finally made public. And it turned out that he had not lied to the FBI at all, and that when he had said that he had not told the Russians that they would get sanctions relief in return for not escalating, he had been telling the truth after all. And by the way, the sequence of that is that the sequel to that is that the Department of Justice, faced with this information, asked the court to set aside Flynn's conviction. The Judge Sullivan, refused to agree, something which at the time I found completely extraordinary, and ultimately the only way Flynn could get this conviction quashed was by having Donald Trump himself pardon him. So this is something that Donald Trump and his team are certain to remember. They must be extremely worried that any discussions they have with the Russians are going to be listened into by people in the intelligence community that are unfriendly to themselves. Trump himself must be worried that if he calls Putin, or if Putin calls him and he speaks to Putin, since he is not yet President of the United States, he's not speaking over a secure line, it may be that unfriendly people are listening into what he's saying, and we could have a whole story whipped up in the media all over again, all kinds of rumours and untrue claims, like the ones involving Flynn, suddenly resurfacing, derailing the transition and sparking a political crisis in exactly the same way as happened in 2016, 2017. And for all of these reasons, I think that Trump is wise to preserve silence. And I also think that his team are probably wise to say as little as possible while the transition is underway about what the administration is doing, and to limit whatever contacts they are having with the Russians to the most simple and innocuous discussions. My own guess is that if there are discussions taking place between Trump's team and the Russians at this time, it's probably more about setting up some kind of conversation between Putin and Trump after Trump takes office than about this specific question of the missile strikes. So that's what it's been taking me a certain amount of time to discuss this, but that I think is probably explains, or at least goes some way to explain, this relative silence from the Trump team that we are seeing. Having said that, both Seymour Hersh and Colonel Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, have their sources, and they both seem to confirm that Trump does want to bring the conflict in Ukraine as soon as possible to an early end. He doesn't want the war to continue. He sees it as a distraction and as a drain on the resources of the United States, and that is what he's going to work towards as soon as he becomes president in January. And for what it's worth, I think that is a comforting sign. Trump's silence can cut both ways. He may not be coming out and publicly criticizing what President Biden has done by launching these missile strikes or allowing these missile strikes to take place. But he has not supported the decision either. So let's look at this. Let's think about what other things are going on. There was supposed to be a NATO meeting yesterday. I presume that was a meeting of the NATO Council. Though if it did happen, I've seen almost nothing about it. There was a meeting of a NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Montreal. I think it was either yesterday or the day before. It came up with the usual aggressively worded document criticizing the Russians, calling for Ukraine to be given all the support it needed, and talking about Ukraine being supplied with medium-range weapons. Medium-range weapons could extend to Tomahawk missiles, though I believe, as it happens, that there is no simple installation that could be supplied to Ukraine, which would enable Tomahawk missiles to be land-launched. The present iterations of the Tomahawk system are all sea-launched. There is the Aegis offshore system in Poland, which could launch Tomahawk missiles. But setting up an analogous installation in Ukraine would take some time, and of course would be noticed by the Russians immediately, and would no doubt be the target of a Russian attack. So for the moment, I think that it could refer to medium-range missiles, could refer to the Tomahawks, but I still think that is unlikely. And besides, I am not sure that Tomahawk missiles are indeed medium-range missiles. What is a medium-range missile? That depends very much on people's definition. I would say that it is a long-range strategic missile, not perhaps an intercontinental missile, but I think its range potentially is more than medium range. Just saying. Anyway, Storm Shadows, ATACMS, Scalps, Taurus missiles, they could also be described and are often described as medium range. And for what it's worth, it could be that the authors of this declaration, which I suspect was drafted some time ago, probably weren't thinking too deeply or too much about this. So I don't myself believe that this Montreal statement means very much, actually. As the NATO Council meeting, if one actually did take place on the 26th of November of yesterday, is a far more serious meeting. That's where policy decisions are actually made, but there's been very, very few reports about it. I'm not sure whether the meeting in the end happened at all, and it could be that if it did, there was no final agreement on what to do. Now, Alistair Crook, former British diplomat, one of the most insightful commentators I know about international questions, has pointed out that one reason why it might be very difficult for the West to decide what to do in this situation in response to the Oreshnik missile is that short of using nuclear weapons, which I doubt that the NATO Council would agree to, Hungary, Slovakia, Turkey, Italy, they would all have to agree, and I can't imagine that they would. Anyway, short of doing that, there isn't actually very much that NATO can do, at least not in the short term. So it could be that this NATO meeting took place and that there was a discussion. I'm going to suggest that, in fact, it was more than a discussion. Angry recriminations might be a more valid description of what was probably happening. But anyway, we're hearing very, very little about it indeed. One NATO leader, Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia, is going to create a lot of anger in NATO. In fact, almost certainly has provoked a lot of anger in NATO by indicating that he's prepared to accept an invitation to attend the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow on May the 9th, 2025, making him, I think, only the second NATO leader. Well, actually, maybe the third if Erdogan has also gone, but after the Austrian Chancellor, to visit Moscow since the start of the special military operation. But anyway, we will see whether Fico follows up with that. But the fact that he's talked about doing that at this time is, of course, does give a very, very strong political signal. Now, coming back to the reasons why Western governments, Western media, the Western political class are so reluctant to talk to Western publics about the dangers of the situation that we find ourselves in. One reason, quite apart from the fact that they clearly worry about the alarm that that would cause, is because they sense that the Western publics don't agree with them. They don't agree with them increasingly about the whole pattern of conflict with Ukraine. We saw that, we've seen that in election after election. In every election, the peace candidate, the candidate that seeks to reduce tensions in Europe and worldwide, globally, tends to do rather well, whilst the more belligerent candidate tends to do badly or even lose. We've seen that in the United States, where, as I've said already, in the recent elections, President Trump, who's talked about ending the war in Ukraine, won against Kamala Harris, who gave every indication of wanting the war to continue. And we've got plenty of data now that shows that worries about the war were an important factor in deciding how people voted. We've seen that in the elections in France, in Slovakia, in France, in Slovakia last year, in Austria recently. We're going to see this quite plausibly in France again, where there are reasons to think that we might be seeing further elections happen soon. And we've just seen it in Romania, where completely unexpectedly, a candidate who is, of course, instantly classified as being far right, principally because he supports some kind of de-escalation of the crisis, came out unexpectedly first in the presidential election. It's unlikely, in my opinion, that this person is going to win the election in the end, though, as I said, I'm not going to try and speculate about the politics of a country, Romania, about which I know very little. But the point is that this candidate spoke about finding some way to improve relations with Russia. And he has done far better than had been expected. And this has provoked, by the way, some astonishing articles in the media in Britain. The Guardian has been talking about how concerning it is that one of Ukraine's allies, Romania, is now starting to look, as they put it, wobbly. And Daniel Johnson, prominent commentator in the Daily Telegraph, has said that the greatest danger at the present time is not what Donald Trump to do, but this dangerous Russophilia, which supposedly is sweeping Europe. That apparently is a problem. Liking another country or entertaining some degree of liking for a country, when that country is Russia, that apparently is a problem, according to Daniel Johnson. So, if we can get through the next couple of weeks, Donald Trump becomes president, if he really does want to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine, the wind will to some extent be in his sails. He will have public opinion in the United States and in Europe behind him. And that is obviously what those people in NATO, in Europe, in the United States, who are pressing on with escalation, probably fear. Now, the ball, to say it again, is in the court of the Russians, and we will see what they do. Again, I've had limited time to try to catch up with all the information on the battlefronts in Ukraine, but from what I've been able to understand, the Russian advance, particularly in southwest Donbass and in Kursk region, continues. The Russians have captured more villages. They've consolidating their control around Kurachovo and other places. There is no sign of any slackening at all in the Russian offensive. The Russians have conducted a reshuffling of their top commanders, though I should say it seems to be a routine rotation of commanders. I don't get the sense that anyone has been retired in any kind of disgrace on this occasion. But the three most important commanders, Teplinsky, who commands Group of Forces Dnieper, Mordvichev, who commands Group of Forces Center, the group of forces that is closing in on Pokrovsk, and which is playing a critically important role at the fighting in Kurachovo, and which recently captured Selidovo, and which previously captured Avdiivka and Ocheretino and Novogrodivka. Anyway, Mordvichev continues to be in place, and General Lapin, who commands Group of Forces North, which is pushing the Ukrainians out of Kursk region and maintaining the Russian positions in Kharkiv region. He remains in place also. So the key commanders, the three key commanders, remain in post. Now, the ball, however, as I said, remains with the Russians. Their advance continues. But they do have to respond to this escalation that the West persists in conducting. I'm going to say something. I think if this escalation continues, if we start before long to see major Russian actions taken in response to what more and more people, not just around the world, but even in Europe itself, judge to be reckless actions by a small group of people at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, in Washington, and in Paris and London, I think that we could find ourselves approaching a public split in NATO itself. Fico, as I said, is going to Hungary. Orban has made his disagreement with what has just been done absolutely clear. The Italians are distancing themselves publicly from what is happening. They've ruled out sending their troops to Ukraine. They've ruled out allowing their weapons to be used in strikes against Russia. They've taken a very clear public stand on all of this. I think if this continues in the way that it is doing, we will see these criticisms escalate potentially to the point of an actual deep split within NATO. And of course, I didn't even mention Erdogan as well, Erdogan's position in Turkey as well. He, of course, continues to speak to Putin. So I think that people who are pressing this escalation probably are not calculating wisely about that either. We remain in a very difficult and dangerous situation. And many people, myself included, wonder how we get off. I don't think Trump is in a position to do anything before he becomes president in January. It all depends on what Vladimir Putin does in the Kremlin. And that, depending on the rationality and political authority of one man, is an extremely dangerous situation for the West, for Europe, and for the world to find themselves in. Right, before I finish my program, I want to talk briefly about the ceasefire that has just been announced between Israel and Hezbollah. Now, I'm going to say straightforwardly that this came as a surprise to me. There was no indication over the last couple of weeks that Israel, that the Netanyahu government was looking for a ceasefire. The terms of the ceasefire, so far as I can see, are an exact replay of the ceasefire that was agreed between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006 after the 2006 fighting, which most people acknowledge was a major humiliation and setback for Israel. Hezbollah supposedly will move its heavy weapons beyond the Litani River. The Lebanese army is supposed to enter southern Lebanon and take over control of the area of the border. And that's basically about it. Now, when that supposedly happened after 2006, it ended up not really happening. The Lebanese army did move south of the Litani River. I remember seeing its armoured vehicles trundling into the villages in southern Lebanon. It doesn't seem to have stayed there for very long. Hezbollah maintained its presence and gradually reinforced it. And we ended up with Hezbollah remaining very powerful in the area of the border, and in fact gradually becoming more powerful over time. And I see no reason at all to think that this time it is going to be any different. If you follow the Israeli media, which I do, you will find that all of Prime Minister Netanyahu's various allies, people like Ben Gvir, for example, and some of his critics, Naftali Bennett being another one, are absolutely furious with him for agreeing to this ceasefire. They'd been led to expect that Hezbollah would be destroyed. Hezbollah is obviously still there. It still has its rockets and its missiles. There are all sorts of claims in the media in London, as I'm saying this, that it's lost something like half its rockets and half its missiles. There isn't any conceivable way that we can know this for a fact, just saying. So Hezbollah is still there. Its military forces are intact. It has withstood the storm as an organization. It has certainly agreed to something that perhaps it would rather not have wanted to agree to. But it can say that it withstood the storm and has simply agreed to something that it agreed previously back in 2006. So one can understand why there is criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Importantly, he failed to obtain the buffer zone in South Lebanon that many of his supporters were expecting that he would achieve. Now, this is not to say that Hezbollah also has not made significant concessions. It is not clear to me whether Hezbollah has agreed to stop its missile strikes on northern Israel. Perhaps it has, in which case Hezbollah is going back on its agreement with Hamas that it would conduct these missile strikes on northern Israel for as long as the conflict in Gaza continued without a ceasefire. Having said that, the fact that there's been a ceasefire achieved in the fighting in Lebanon may mean that we are now finally looking at a possible ceasefire in Gaza as well. I don't want to pretend that I know more than I do, but it would not surprise me. Why has Prime Minister Netanyahu done this, given that he has not fulfilled the expectations of his supporters in Israel, and is therefore coming in for a huge amount of criticism? There's some speculation that it's because the Israeli army itself is exhausted, and I have absolutely no doubt that that is true, but then Prime Minister Netanyahu has never paid a huge amount of attention to that. I do not believe that the recent decision of the ICC to issue an arrest warrant against him played any part in this. Others, of course, say that it was pressure from the Americans, but then that begs the question, which Americans? President Biden is, of course, now the President of the United States. He has been seeking a ceasefire or ceasefires from Prime Minister Netanyahu, or so he says, for the better part of a year. Is it likely, given that Netanyahu has consistently rejected this up to now, that he would agree to it just a few weeks before President Biden leaves office? If pressure from the Americans has played a role, I would suggest that it is more likely to have come from Donald Trump's team than from the Biden administration. My sense remains that for all the visceral feelings, all the strong antagonism that Trump himself and other members of his team have about Iran, Donald Trump does not want a war in the Middle East, just as I sense that he wants to wrap up as soon as he can the war in Ukraine. He has a very busy agenda domestically in front of him. He wants to launch an assault on what is referred to as on the permanent government of the United States in Washington. He has a major program for cutting back spending in the United States. He doesn't want at this time to be distracted by wars in Ukraine or in the Middle East. However, we are getting reports that he and his team are going to shift emphasis away from combat, attacks and strikes and all of that against Iran to a major a further major attempt to suffocate Iran's economy by escalating the sanctions against Iran. Maximum pressure, in other words. And I wonder whether Trump, who I suspect would not be as inhibited in talking to the Israelis, in fact, he's had a meeting, as I understand, with Netanyahu, even a conversation with him, which he's not, of course, been able to do with the Russians. Anyway, I don't think he'd be inhibited, and his team would not be inhibited, about talking to the Israelis. I wonder whether the Trump people are telling Netanyahu that Trump absolutely does want a de-escalation of the crisis in the Middle East, that is what Trump is going to insist on when he becomes president, but it is a de-escalation of only a certain kind, because even though military strikes might be called off or reduced, if only to a certain extent, a major program for destabilizing Iran is going to be unleashed in its place. So please let me stress again, this is not a decision that seeks a general settlement or a peace in the Middle East. It's simply a way of shifting the pressure from military means to economic ones. Anyway, that's my best guess. I'm far from convinced, by the way, that this ceasefire is going to hold. Prime Minister Netanyahu is obviously now under significant domestic political pressure in Israel itself. And of course, it may be that if Hezbollah maintains a visible presence in southern Lebanon, or if Hezbollah missile strikes on northern Israel continue, then we will see a return to war. But anyway, that is my best explanation at the present time for why this sudden agreement to a ceasefire has been made. We'll see in time whether I'm right. This is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick this the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.